earlier for the previous hour, but our colleague Rachel Pereira, who is the director of the Electoral and Senatorial Policy Unit at Privy Council, has joined us. Mr. Chair, this is to discuss with your committee Bill C-65, the Electoral Participation Act. Comme les députés le savent, dans ma lettre de
As members of parliament know, in my mandate letter, I was made to examine the recommendations of the Chief Electoral Officer to reinforce protection against foreign interference and disinformation, and to examine the interaction between technology and democracy in order to protect Canada's elections and democratic institutions. Bill C-65, which is before you, is the culmination of these three priorities. Mr. Chair, as its first priority, Bill C-65 proposes, amongst other measures, to add 2 advanced polling days, improve the special ballot voting process, and make the popular vote on campus program permanent. As an MP of Beauséjour, I'm very proud to be representing the University in New Brunswick. I see the students voting proudly during elections on campus. We want to make this program permanent.
Still remains the single most popular and traditional way for Canadians to vote. For that reason, our government in Bill C-65 proposed to move the October 2025 fixed election date by 1 week forward to avoid a conflict with Diwali and certain municipal elections in provinces like Alberta. That being said, Mr. Chair, I've certainly taken note of comments from colleagues, and I'm happy to reiterate the comments I made at the second reading debate, that the government will, of course, happily respect the will of this committee should there be a desire to amend the legislation and move the date forward even further or move it back to the October 20th date. I'm happy to see the work of this committee. I trust, Mr. Chair, that we can move forward on the many important amendments in this bill that we think that are proposed, that we think improve safeguards for our elections. Take, for example, the proposed improvements for long-term care residents and those persons with disabilities, which seeks to give electors the ability to select an individual to assist them. This was recommended by the Chief Electoral Officer with the existing integrity measures in place. So I think of persons in my riding who may have limited reading skills, who may want a trusted person with them to help them ensure that, in fact, they're casting the vote for the person they intend to vote for. Mr. Chair, the second priority of Bill C-65 is the protection of personal information. This legislation proposes new privacy policy requirements as a condition of registration for federal political parties, with the Canada Elections Act continuing to be a national, uniform, and exclusive regime for federal political parties' dealings with personal information. And finally, and this is an important one, Mr. Chair, it sort of picks up on our previous discussion. Bill C-65 proposes a number of measures to continue to meet the evolving threats of foreign interference and disinformation. This would be done through measures that would, for example, extend the existing bans on foreign influence and misleading publications so that they apply at all times and not just during a particular election period, and add a new ban to protect against intentional disinformation about candidates and the facts of our electoral process. And by that I would mean polling locations, sort of the mechanics of the electoral process. Monsieur le Président, la protection des élections au Canada.
Mr. Chair, protecting Canada's elections should not be a partisan issue. This bill contains many important measures that Canadians want to see implemented before the next election. I hope that as parliamentarians, we can work together to improve the legislation as should be the case, and as your committee will do, probably, I hope, to ensure the passage of this legislation, which will guarantee that Canadian elections are accessible, transparent, and resilient to threats to our democracy. I see you nodding, Mr. Chair. It probably means that you would like me to stop the extraordinary remarks I've just shared with you. I will do so with delight to answer your questions. Thank you, Mr. Minister.
For 6 minutes. Mr. Chair, and thank you to the Minister for being here. I want to get into the details for Canadians to know exactly how this bill came together in full cooperation with the NDP. I don't want to get too personal, Minister, but do you remember this year on Valentine's Day who you had dinner with?
I do. It was a very romantic moment. I live in New Brunswick. I was in Ottawa. I was away from, obviously, my family. And it was a February night, and we went to a great place called Colonnade Pizza. It's at the corner of Metcalfe and Gilmore, and I went. It's great pizza. I would invite you to go. And my date for that evening was a great guy. You maybe remember him. Daniel Blakey was his name.
Yes, well, thank you. So Daniel Blakey was the lead negotiator for the NDP on this bill, and as a matter of fact, he stood right behind you in March when you made the announcement, and you and said on multiple occasions that this bill was part of the coalition to secure the continued support of the NDP. You even said at the press conference that you gave in response, quote, "The Prime Minister and Mr. Singh agreed to these important measures." Question, whose idea? Was it a Liberal idea or an NDP idea to change the date of the election so that soon-to-be defeated, dozens of them, NDP and Liberal MPs, would be guaranteed their pension? Liberal idea or NDP idea?
Mr. Chair, you'll allow me to correct some of the falsehoods in the premise of that question. You referred to a coalition. I know your leader's office wants you to keep using that phrase. We don't have a coalition with the NDP. It's called a supply and confidence agreement. Mr. Blakey wasn't the lead negotiator. I'm surprised you're using union terms, Mr. Duncan. That's great to see the Conservative Party has embraced the labor movement. Mr. Blakey was a partner with me as we developed this legislation, something that our leaders agreed to transparently in a supply and confidence agreement that was posted on the internet. So I know that you look for secret sort of meetings. The Valentine's Day dinner was so secret, we posted it on Twitter, and our leader...
So, Minister, here's the thing, is that we just got information minutes before this meeting started of, in fact, secret meetings that did take place only after Conservatives asked. We found information here that on January 25th, that there was NDP headquarters representatives that got a meeting with the Prime Minister's office, staff from your office in Elections Canada to get information and briefings behind the scenes, only revealed afterwards. Do you think it's appropriate that the NDP, not just MPs, on two different occasions, NDP party headquarters staff got access to the Prime Minister's office and to Elections Canada to get briefings that were not offered to any other party? I don't think Canadians find that very funny, and it was secret until we asked for details.
Again, you're a very experienced sleuth here, Mr. Duncan. I would congratulate you for that investigative work. This is absolutely normal. So do I think it's appropriate? Absolutely. Do I think it's normal in a Westminster parliamentary system where there's a supply and confidence agreement? Of course it is. These were routine meetings of senior officials of the Privy Council office. Mr. Sutherland was in some of these meetings. I was in meetings with Mr. Sutherland and the Chief Electoral Officer himself, where Mr. Blakey was present, so we could understand the advice both of the Privy Council officials and Elections Canada as we work together to develop this legislation. So you find it shocking that parliamentarians work together in a collaborative way. We think it's something that Canadians would find very positive.
What Canadians would not find positive is that NDP party headquarters staff were invited and attended those meetings. That is completely inappropriate of what happened there, where one political party was given access to information and documents and crafted a bill. But I'll go back again. The whole point that now the NDP absolutely wants to ignore and forget about was the changing of the election date. Was it a Liberal idea or an NDP idea to move back the election by a week so it guarantees any defeated Liberal and NDP MPs their pension? Whose idea was it, the Liberals or the NDP?
So again, you're a very clever clip you just got for some post that you may do later. But I think it's important for people to understand that pension entitlement had nothing to do with that decision to move the date. I'm lucky enough, I was elected in 2000, so it certainly wasn't my idea to be concerned about pension entitlement for myself. We think that Diwali is an important moment for a very significant community in Canada. There are municipal elections in the province of Alberta on that date. We worked with Elections Canada on a number of different scenarios of different dates. But as I said, Mr. Duncan, in order to reassure you that the little premise of your question, which you fabricate, wasn't the case, we would welcome this committee's judgment in moving the date and would welcome that when you get to the clause by clause, feel free to work with colleagues if you're so outraged and you want to explain why Diwali or the municipal elections in Alberta aren't important. Go ahead. But anytime you move the date, you're going to bump into a problem somewhere.
And here's the thing, Minister, is that it's not about Diwali, because what happened was when you moved it back a week, it then coincided with a territorial election and overlaps into Quebec. What you could have done was move the election earlier if that was truly the reason, and it's not. It's about securing the pensions by giving the election happening a week later. People know that because even just last week we heard when we asked your own officials, why don't you call it earlier, including into the summer? And it was, quote, the sorts of considerations that were made, you wouldn't want to break with summer holidays through Labor Day. That was the reason your officials said it didn't get moved earlier. So, Minister, I'll ask you, you don't want to have an election that coincides through Labor Day. When was the last time that happened?
I haven't taken note of every election. I remember one.
Let me
you asked me a question.
It was the last election. Either way, the Prime Minister called it when it was opportunistic for him, and now suddenly you forget when the last election was called.
This is the second time now today that I have had members around this table not respond to my intervention, and you guys are going to flip out in 45 minutes from now, or 40 minutes from now, or 30 minutes from now when I try to end this meeting, because you say there wasn't enough time for the minister. Respect the authority of the chair to try to operate the meeting in an effective and an efficient manner. Minister, there's no time left for a response. There's no time left for a question. Mr. Turnbull, the floor is yours for 6 minutes.
Minister, good to see you. The Conservative leader has been the only federal party leader that has been unwilling to get his security clearance. I would say, describe it as he's doing a bit of a wiggle worm, trying to get out of it. First, we heard the Conservatives say he can't because he'd be muzzled, but we know that's not true because every party leader other than him has got the security clearance and has received the briefings. We also know that the next excuse that was given was that he already had the clearance from back when he was in the Harper cabinet. We know that's not true because I asked the former clerk of the Privy Council, Michael Wernick, when he was here many months ago, and he said, no, if there's a change in life circumstances or a change in job or every 5 years that those background checks have to be redone. Can we clarify that current Conservative leader does not have top secret level security clearance? Quickly.
That is my understanding, Mr. Turnbull, for the reasons you just enunciated.
Thank you. And the other thing that we've heard from the Conservatives recently is that the background check is too intrusive for them, which is kind of hilarious considering every other person that takes national security seriously would go through the same intrusive background check to be able to get those briefings. Now, the latest version of this is that the Conservatives say, we need to use the threat reduction measure.
Mr. Turnbull, sorry, I've got a point of order. Thank you. Monsieur Berthold.
Pertinence, Monsieur le Président.
Relevance, Mr. Chair.
As a reminder, we are here on 65 specifically. Mr. Turnbull, if you can try to direct your question to how it is relevant to 65, I would appreciate that. I'll turn the floor back over to you. Thank you.
On the same point of order?
Yes, Ms. O'Connell.
Mr. Chair, I recognize it's on C-65. However, this is directly related to foreign interference, which is part of the bill. I would also argue that Mr. Duncan brought up party officials of the NDP. Part of this bill is also talking about, sorry, did I interrupt you? I was able to contain my composure. I would suggest you do the same. But Mr. Chair, without being interrupted, Mr. Duncan brought up party officials, and Mr. Turnbull is discussing the Conservative Party, and I suspect the leadership race that has been called into question with foreign interference, so I think it's relevant.
Okay, thank you for your insight, Ms. O'Connell. Mr. Turnbull, I'll turn the floor back over to you.
So now we have the Conservatives saying that, we should just use a threat reduction measure. But wouldn't that be subject to the same limitations in terms of the Security of Information Act? So in a way, it doesn't get around this idea that somehow the Conservative leader could get a briefing through a threat reduction measure, which would allow him maybe more narrow in scope briefing, but it would still be subject to the Security of Information Act, would it not?
Mr. Turnbull, you're absolutely right. The threat reduction measures, we talked about that earlier in the meeting, allow CSIS officials to brief somebody because of an imminent or an ongoing threat to national security. The information that they would share in a threat reduction measure, for example, with the leader of the opposition, whether or not he obtained a security clearance, would absolutely be subject to the Security of Information Act. What that means in more simple terms is a person who would receive information, highly sensitive information, as part of an authorized threat reduction measure, would legally be bound to keep that information secret. And as you know, Mr. Turnbull, those, in fact, it's a criminal statute, the Security of Information Act. Violation of it brings a criminal prosecution. But it's done very specifically to protect the ability of CSIS to protect human sources. It's to protect their investigative capacities.
Thank you. And my understanding is that the briefing that would be for a threat reduction measure would be only the need to know information that would be limited in scope to specific to a personal threat of perhaps a member in the Conservative caucus in this particular case. So it would be not the same, it wouldn't be equivalent to a broader intelligence briefing that one could receive if they had the top secret security clearance. Is that correct?
You're absolutely right. That briefing would, as I understood from the director of CSIS, reveal the minimum information necessary in their judgment. None of this is decided by a partisan person, but in the director of CSIS's judgment, the minimum information necessary for that particular leader to take measures to reduce the threat. That's why it's called a threat reduction measure. But it would not provide in that particular threat reduction measure interview a broader threat landscape briefing or a more broader briefing about certain threat vectors that one would get if one had the top secret security clearance. But again, Mr. Turnbull, what's important is that all of that information that would be shared, whatever the instrument legally that was used to share that information, binds the person receiving the information to the provisions of the criminal statute known as the Security of Information Act.
Okay, last question is, so we've had the Conservative MP that actually is on the NSI COP committee, which is the Committee of All Parliamentarians. Come to this committee. He's presented a private member's bill. He said he wants all members of Parliament to be able to get a security clearance. And when he was here, he actually said he thought if he had his way that he would make it mandatory for all MPs to have a security clearance. I find that slightly ironic given the fact that the Conservative leader is the only leader in the House of Commons that has not been willing to get his security clearance. Minister LeBlanc, do you find that slightly ironic?
Well, of course I find it ironic, and we've happy to discuss Mr. Ruff's bill at another point, but it does lay bare, I think, the hypocrisy, Mr. Turnbull, of what that particular Conservative member's leader is doing. But thank you for raising that important point.
We have time left, Chair. Perfect. So I will ask one more question. In terms of the Conservatives have always talked down our government's efforts on combating foreign interference. And yet when I look at the facts and I read all the reports, which I have done for many months on this committee as we've studied it, it seems as though what they're claiming is just patently false, that our government is actually a leader in stepping up and providing an ecosystem approach that really looks at how we can combat and prevent any interference in our democracy. Minister LeBlanc, can you please talk about how C-65 adds to the toolbox and gives us an even stronger ecosystem for preventing foreign interference?
I'm sorry, Mr. Turnbull, we don't have time for the response. We're
Preamble was enough.
We're well over. Yeah, exactly. Madame Gill, bienvenue encore. 6 minutes.
Ms. Gill, welcome back again. Thank you. Mr. Minister, we appreciate all those accompanying you today. I have questions. First of all, a question. Well, it's something you mentioned several times. The idea that C-65 seeks to improve access to voting and voter turnout. And for us, the Bloc Québécois, what concerns us is the overlap between the federal elections with the municipal elections in Quebec. On several occasions during your opening remarks and during your various interventions, you said you took into account the situation in Alberta, but for municipal elections in Quebec, I don't know what you said. The Union of Municipalities in Quebec contacted us at the committee, and they themselves said they had concerns about that. Maybe you could tell us what you think about that. I could quote you part of the letter saying that they are expressing concern about Section 5, where there's the overlap concerning the dates. This could have a negative impact. So I would like to know what you would respond to the UMQ. Thank you for the question, Ms. Gill. I'm very happy to see you in the committee today. I took note of the concerns expressed by the Union of Municipalities of Quebec. I worked at the Minister of Infrastructure at the time, and it's the Mayor of Gaspé who was the president of the union at the time. I know the good work they are doing and the importance of making sure that as much as possible, a federal election shouldn't overlap with a fixed date election, as is the case in many municipal elections. I understand that maybe in your province you are talking about advanced polling. I may be mistaken, but I imagine that the committee, your committee, will look into the question of the dates, but that is specifically the problem with a fixed date election. The fall is a very busy electoral period. We had 4 provincial elections this fall. Some political parties would like to bring down our election and get an early election. Well, sorry to interrupt you, Mr. Minister. You are not really answering my question. I understand that you've taken note of it. So you've taken note of their concerns, but at the same time, I wanted an answer. Maybe to give you the context, it's not only about the election date. There's a problem of premises, electoral staff. Sometimes you have the same people working in federal and provincial elections. So the difficulty may be more important. There's another issue of concern for us as well, for many reasons. But I will mention one. There's accessibility, the idea of increasing the voter turnout rate. I had the opportunity last week, or I think the beginning of this week, we talked about the issue of accessibility. Even the people celebrating Diwali will be able to vote. I don't want to put words in your mouth, in Mr. Sutherland's mouth, but mathematically speaking, everyone may vote with the current changes without us postponing the election date. So why maintain a date that no one here wants? Because everyone will be able to vote, whether it be Diwali or without Diwali. People will be able to celebrate and vote. So why maintain that date if mathematically speaking everyone can vote? Thank you. Very good question. maybe in my comments I wasn't clear enough. We are maintaining the date well. We are conscious of the public comments made by many MPs, and we will be at ease changing the date if the committee feels that there's a need for the date to be changed. You are right. Technically, and this applies to municipal elections in Quebec, theoretically speaking, everyone could plan to vote by mail, in advance polling, but on the voting day, on the elections day, and this is something we saw this week in the United States 2 days ago, tens and thousands of people turned out to vote. On the election date, for reasons we understand, that election date is very interesting for millions of Canadians. I'm sorry I'll have to interrupt you once again. I understand what you're saying, but simply to clarify, because we all keep coming back to the voting day. As I said, well, you're saying that people may go vote, but once again, it takes resources. It's not simply a single voting date. It's more accessible, so we'll need more resources, more premises for a while. We don't even know what the impact, the overlap will have, the overlap of two elections. If people want, it's one thing for people to be able to vote anytime, but it's something else to organize two elections at the same time. There's the issue of human and material resources. That's something else. I understand that the committee will be looking into it. But I would like you to respond because you are the one who worked on the bill. So I imagine that these are the types of questions that may come up. We need to give the minister the opportunity to answer, but I need to complete my question. Mr. Minister, thank you, Chair. I totally share the concerns that you have expressed when it comes to premises. We've added 2 advanced polling days, and there will be community centers, municipal halls would likely be rented out for longer periods. So you are right, Ms. Gill, in that sense. But as I said, irrespective of the date we choose for a fixed date election, and yet again, I take note that you want elections right away. I took note of your leader's leader, that you're working hard to make sure that we don't get to a fixed date election in October next year. So you're working hard to make sure that's not the case. But irrespective of the date we choose on a fixed date election act, there's going to be tension. And you are right. It's not ideal, be it for religious reasons, municipal elections, provincial elections. We are doing the best we can. And the good news is that voters are very resilient. Thank you, Ms. Gill.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister. Minister, as I'm sure you've seen here and in many other meetings, we know that the facts just don't seem to matter to our Conservative colleagues, which is really upsetting to see. They are very, very good at making clips, though, and I just want to acknowledge that often those clips are posted before we even leave the meeting, so I will give them credit for being exceptional clippers. At the risk of yes, and my colleagues are agreeing that they are very good at clipping, so that's good. Mr. Chair, my question to the Minister today is around the election date. Now, at a risk of repeating myself over and over again, as soon as the implications to MP pensions was brought to my attention and my colleagues of the NDP attention, I was immediately up in the House of Commons proposing a solution to remove the clause that would make that come into effect. My colleagues, on the other hand, stood up to try to have the entire bill completely delayed, not put into place, because they don't want to see improvements to our elections process. They want to keep it exactly the way it is because it benefits them. And so my question to you, Minister, is I put forward an amendment on June 18th. My colleague MP Matheson put forward an amendment on June 18th to remove the clause that would put this unintended benefit, at least that's what I would assume it would be, unintended benefit to the MP's pensions, to remove that portion. Would you be in support of that amendment to see that portion removed?
Again, Mr. Chair, to Ms. Barron, thank you for the question. I won't be voting at this committee when you do your clause-by-clause work. You can speak to my Liberal colleagues and see how they will vote. I have said that as a representative of the government, if the committee decides to change that date, return the date 7 days earlier, that's entirely up to the committee. The pension consideration was not the consideration in the numerous so-called secret discussions that I would have had with your former colleague, Daniel Blakey, who stood with me when we announced this bill, including the date. I just draw your attention to that. But the controversy is such that if people want to change the date, that's fine. I do totally agree with you, Ms. Barron, that the Conservatives use that. Again, I was fisheries minister. There's an expression in English, red herring. They use that as an excuse to ensure that some of the things that we worked on, the NDP caucus and our government, to make voting more accessible. Do you think the Conservatives, Ms. Barron, want to have campus voting? Of course they don't. You think they want to ensure that mail-in ballots are more accessible? No. Everything they have done when Mr. Poilievre had my job at democratic institutions was to make voting more difficult. So you're right. They'll sort of contourner. They'll frame the argument around a date to distract from what I think, I don't know if you agree with me, is a desire to ensure that we don't either strengthen the elections regime to resist foreign interference as recommended by the Chief Electoral Officer of Canada, or deal with some of those accessibility issues that I think all parliamentarians should be interested in.
Thank you, Minister. I agree with a lot of what was said, and I believe that it is vitally important for us to be sitting around this table and talking about how to strengthen our elections. So I'm happy that we are discussing this bill today. There are some concerns that have been brought forward that I wanted to quickly ask when we had representatives from the CLC and the PSAC that were here. They were speaking to the concerns around they're nervous that the existing legislation is too broad and that it doesn't specify the right for unions to be able to communicate freely with their members. I'm wondering if you can clarify if you share that concern and if you see any concerns with us making any amendments to this bill to ensure that those rights are protected.
Ms. Barron, thank you for the question. Again, I certainly wouldn't purport to offer advice to a standing committee of the House that hasn't begun its clause by clause and what amendments in the judgment of the committee would be appropriate to pass. But I do share your concern. These particular elements of the bill, and maybe Mr. Sutherland has more technical experience than I would have in terms of the origin of this particular measure, it was specifically to ensure that the ability of unions or other third parties, we're focusing on unions, but other third parties that can participate in communications with their members in an election, have obligations under the Act to register. I think it's important that there be a transparency in terms of what unions would be doing, either in terms of third-party spending, advertising, but also in terms of communicating with their members. I think the concern was around not having a foreign actor use a particular union or other third-party participant in the election as a front to inappropriately or illegally interfere in the Canadian election. So there's a long history of unions, something we support, participating in the democratic process. So we would certainly share the concern that you have expressed and that union leaders would express around not inadvertently restricting what is a long-standing practice of unions being able to participate in the election. But it has to be done in a transparent way so that foreign money wouldn't flow to a union, or that a union, and it's not one of the big unions that you mentioned that might have been at this table, they're long-standing, reputable organizations that have existed for a long time. I think the concern may be around a smaller group that would suddenly, and we've seen it with respect to the earlier conversation around some Russian influence. One has to be careful to ensure that there's transparency and rigor, but in no way would we seek to limit what has been a historical right for them to participate in an electoral process, unions or other third parties.
Minister,
we think that's a good thing.
That's all the time. Thanks very much, Ms. Barron. Mr. Cooper, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Minister, you have stated with respect to the clause in the bill that pushes back the date of the next federal election, that the reason for that was to avoid a conflict with the holiday. You said that before. You said it at committee, but the date that was selected conflicts with the territorial election in Nunavut. And the chief electoral officer came before this committee and indicated that that would significantly strain electoral resources in Nunavut. So you talked about the holiday being important. I agree it is important. I agree the Alberta municipal elections are important. But do you not think the territorial election in Nunavut is also important? And why is it that of all the dates that were chosen, you chose that specific date?
So, Mr. Chair, Mr. Cooper, I think, identifies again something which I said is an ongoing challenge with a fixed election date. I hope Mr. Cooper in the House of Commons hasn't been using in any of his questions the silly phrase about time being up. Because, Mr. Cooper, you would, of course, want to have an election right now, so you shouldn't be worried about a fixed election date next October. But I'm glad you're turning your attention to that.
In solving this problem, you've created another problem in terms of a date that conflicts with a territorial election, which will have an adverse impact on the territory in terms of conducting two elections on the same date. But, you know, Minister, it does solve one problem, a problem not that Canadians have, but a problem that NDP Liberal politicians have, and that is that soon-to-be defeated NDP and Liberal MPs who would not qualify for their pension will suddenly collect their pension. They're going to pad their pockets. That's what the effect of it would be, is to pad the pockets of soon-to-be defeated NDP Liberal MPs. The fact that you profess ignorance of that fact is only because you've been caught, and the fact that you're willing to back down is, again, because you've been caught. Canadians have realized that that is exactly what you did or tried to do. So I'm going to put the question to you once again, a question you refused to answer when Mr. Duncan asked you. Whose idea was it to pad your pockets? Was it your idea, or was it the leader of the NDP's idea?
So congratulations, Mr. Cooper, on your clip. I hope you can get it up before the end of the meeting.
Just answer the question.
In the premise to your question, you had a series of, again, I find it very arrogant, Mr. Chair, that one would say soon to be defeated MPs. I wouldn't purport to decide how the voters in Edmonton, St. Albert will deal with Mr. Cooper in the next election. There's a certain arrogance, I think, from the Conservatives to say that, first of all, their members who would have, in their obsession with the pension focus, have benefited also. The idea that none of them might risk being defeated is the supreme arrogance I find.
Minister, answer the question. Whose idea was it? Was it your idea? Was it the leader of the NDP's idea? I asked you a very straightforward question. Answer the question.
So, Mr. Chair, we have explained when we introduced the bill that we had worked on this bill with the NDP caucus, as in the case it was Mr. Blakey, with respect to an agreement that Mr. Singh and the Prime Minister made. And we have noticed the manufactured indignation from the Conservatives around this issue. I agree with Ms. Barron to perhaps prevent them from dealing with what we think are substantive and positive issues in this.
When you had your behind closed doors secret meeting with the NDP, we see in response that Al Sutherland attended that meeting, but who in the PMO sat in on that meeting with officials in the NDP?
Again, Mr. Chair, it was such a secret meeting at a great pizza place on Metcalfe that we posted it on Twitter. But
referring to the meeting on January 25th, where the chief electoral officer, among others, met with officials in the NDP. And the question we had asked was, who in the PMO, who in your office was at that meeting, if anyone?
There's 15 seconds left.
So, again, Mr. Sutherland addressed that. He was at that meeting. By recollection, I think the meeting took place in my office in the Confederation building. There was nobody from the Prime Minister's office in that meeting. I certainly don't have a recollection of that. I was working with a parliamentarian from another caucus who shared our objective in preparing this legislation, and we were lucky to benefit from the nonpartisan advice of both senior public servants and Elections Canada. There's no mystery. The Conservatives find it shocking that people would work together to try and improve our electoral system. I don't think Canadians find it shocking that parliamentarians would work together to strengthen our democracy as opposed to try and vandalize it like Mr. Cooper would do.
Okay, thank you very much, Minister. Ms. Romanato, 5 minutes to you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Chair. Through you, I also like to thank the Minister for being here with us. I just want to mention something. Mr. Minister, the date for the Quebec municipal elections is Sunday, 2nd of November. My colleague, Ms. Gill, quoted a letter we received from the Union of Municipalities of Quebec. But let me quote something that was also mentioned in that same letter. It's saying, we propose to set the date on the 1st of December 2025, and this would significantly reduce the overlap period to 21 days, according to the date for triggering elections. So even the union asked that it be taken to the 1st of December, so later.
Mr. Minister, if you would like to...
No, si vous me permettez juste, parce que j'avais oublié.
If you may allow, I forgot that, Ms. Romanodo. Maybe the Conservatives will see a secret plot between the municipalities of Quebec and us to make sure that some MPs receive their pensions. I would not have imagined that they were part of the plot, but we risk seeing a message on social media in that direction. And you are totally right. This shows the challenge we have coming up with a fixed date election. The fall period is very busy. Ms. Ramanado, we are not triggering an election right away. There are some other political parties who want an election right away. Such disrespect for people in Nova Scotia who are now involved in their provincial elections.
Just wanted to say, as my colleague across the way, Madame Baron, said, that the NDP will be bringing forward an amendment to this when we get to clause by clause. And I said in the last meeting that should that amendment be brought forward to keep the date on the 20th of October, I'd be prepared to support that. With that, though, part of this bill, it's 48 pages long, and we've been focusing a lot on the date. But there's so many more important things. You said it yourself. It's called the Elections Participation Act. And I want to talk a little bit about the measures that are in this bill that talk about increasing voter participation. And one of the parts that you talked about a little bit, but I would like to get more feedback from you, is on legislating campus vote. I know that we were not able to do that in the last election because of COVID, but I'd like to elaborate a little, if you could, on the importance of helping students who may be at universities outside of their home province, their home riding, the ability to participate in that. We've heard previously that when voters start voting at a young age, they're more likely to continue to vote. So could you elaborate a little bit on the importance of this measure?
Through you, Mr. Chair, Madame Romanado, thank you for, again, focusing on what we think should be a very positive, nonpartisan element of this bill. For the exact reasons you enunciated, encouraging young people on campuses to be able to vote. It's proven to be effective. It's easier for students to vote on campus. I think of Mount Allison University in my riding. It's an undergraduate, largely undergraduate campus. People, I think 30 or 40% of the students may come from New Brunswick. 60% would come from other provinces, a number of them from your province. When I visit the campus, there are students from across the country, obviously international students across the country. Their ability to be able to vote in an October election when they've been on campus, some of them maybe only for a month and a half, is very important. And we think that it shouldn't be at the discretion of a local returning officer. In the case of my riding in Beauséjour, Parliament should clearly express its view that Elections Canada and the returning officers in every constituency have an obligation to ensure that the polls can be accessible on university campuses. There are measures in the legislation around making it easier to get mail-in ballots. I spoke about some of the measures in terms of persons in long-term care homes. Many of these recommendations come, Madame Romanado, as you would know, from Elections Canada itself. Elections Canada does terrific work. It's world leading and recognized globally as one of the most effective, secure, competent, nonpartisan administrators of national elections in 4.5 time zones, in 10 provinces and 3 territories. They do terrific work, including with their provincial counterparts. So we should, as a committee and as a parliament, be very sensitive to the nonpartisan suggestions and recommendations that in their judgment they would make. And we've tried to do that as much as possible to validate the great work that they do.
Thank you, Ms. Romanado. Madame Gill, 2 minutes 30 secondes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Tout d'abord, j'aimerais...
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to come back to the 2 questions that I asked earlier to state that the change of date means 2 things. It's not just a date. It means that you're deciding to give precedence to religion over democracy, and that can harm democracy. So that is why I wanted to come back to changing the date. And, Mr. Chair, with all due respect, when the witnesses cannot answer in full, they can submit their answers in writing. And so I'd like to hear from the minister to see if he has any more to say on that in your deliberations. And finally, in a question on participation, I understand that you likely don't know all of these sections, but 231, 1 and 2, concerning votes where someone can be accompanied when they need assistance. And I think that you also talk about that in your preliminary remarks. I'd like to know, why was this change made to broaden the acceptance of someone to accompanying them? And secondly, concerning the swearing in, and that was removed. And for me, I'm wondering why previously the person had to swear in to not spoil the vote and to try to influence the vote, and now that's simply been removed from these sections. So for voters who need assistance and who want to ensure the legitimacy of the vote, I don't understand why that change is made. So I'd like to hear from you on that, please. If you'd allow me, it's a very technical question and a good one. Rachel is fully ready to explain. A lot of these changes, rather technical changes, were inspired by the work of Elections Canada and their recommendations, and Rachel can perhaps give more additional information on that. And once again, there's not much time left, so quickly, please, and you may submit something later if you wish. Thank you. Thank you for your question.
Things that are being done in the bill for electors with disabilities or who need assistance marking their own ballot. The bill removes the restriction on who can help them. So those electors, so right now it's limited to family and friends, but those electors will be able to choose anyone, including a personal support worker or someone else to help them. The other measure in the bill is that that individual who assists an elector who needs assistance can help more than one person. That's the restriction that's being removed. The integrity measures are still in place. They cannot influence that vote. They cannot share the vote. It has to be secret. But that allows, for example, in a long-term care institution, a personal support worker, a healthcare worker to help more than one elector if they need assistance marking their ballot.
Very much, Madame Pereira. Merci, Madame Gill. Ms. Barron, 2.5 minutes too.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Minister. Minister, I just want to first reiterate that, quite frankly, even though I wasn't directly the lead like my colleague Daniel Blakey was, former MP Daniel Blakey, I'm incredibly proud of the work that has been done to increase participation, to improve our elections. This is vitally important work that we all need to be focused on, and instead the Conservatives want to focus on an aspect of this bill that, from the sounds of it, is going to be resolved in the clause by clause if all of my colleagues follow through with what they are saying today. And so I just want to reiterate that I'm happy that we were able to talk about some of the positives of this bill as well as the concerns, because there's still time for those concerns to be mitigated in the clause by clause. I did want to take the time, Minister, to ask you about an incident that I actually just recently found out about a former Conservative MP, his last name was Butt, MP Butt, from 2014, who claimed he saw voter card cards being misused and deliberately misled the House and later retracted these comments. And I know we're talking about, in this bill, false statements being made, and I know you talked about how these are more around the mechanics or the mechanisms of the bill, but I'm wondering if you have any thoughts of any mechanisms that could be put into place to ensure Conservative members of Parliament or any members of Parliament cannot deliberately mislead the House and Canadians.
So, Ms. Barron, thank you for that question. And you're right. There is a lot in this bill, I think, that speaks to shared objectives that our leaders have about making the electoral system more accessible, ensuring continued confidence of Canadians in the electoral system. So I look forward to the committee's work in this regard. You raised, I don't remember that specific incident, although I was in the House 10 years ago, already 10 years ago in 2014. But I do remember the so-called Unfair Elections Act that the then conservative government introduced. I think I mentioned it in answer to a previous question, deliberately tried to restrict the ability of persons to show up at a polling station with the card they receive in the mail saying this is the advanced polling date, this is the election date, you vote at this location. We've all received those cards. When we're canvassing an election, people go and get their card to ask questions about, this is a normal thing that happens. And we think that was a reasonable way for people to present themselves at the polling station and confirm their identity. The Conservatives sought to make it more difficult.
Can I just ask just a question before I run out of time? Were the Liberals consulted on this Elections Act that was being put forward? Were there any other parties aside from the Conservatives consulted when this act was being put forward? Do you recall this from 2014?
Again, I can't speak to other parties. You have some long-serving colleagues that could answer with respect to consultations with your party or your caucus, Ms. Barron, but certainly Mr. Harper's government would have had absolutely no interest in hearing from opposition MPs in terms of strengthening the Elections Act. Mr. Harper's government was focused on making voting more difficult, more restrictive, suppressing the vote. They certainly didn't ask. We were then the third party in opposition in 2014. They certainly didn't consult us when they sought to bring in a series of those sort of restrictive amendments.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Barron. Okay, colleagues, that's the end of today. Minister, thank you for making yourself available. Officials, same to you. Meeting adjourned, colleagues.